Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I wanted to talk with you about the books that I read in December. I actually did do my own version of Vlogmas in that I recorded like vlogs throughout the week and posted weekly vlogs about what I was reading in the month of December, but there are some books on here that I finished after that because the 12 Days of Christmas started out, so I did not end up posting my thoughts or posting my very last vlog because I had clips like closing out a vlog, and then I was so busy preparing for the 12 Days of Christmas that I did not get that edited and up for you. So there are definitely books that I read or finished that I did not talk about in those. I'm actually going to be going in order of like star rating, and I'll let you know if there's a vlog that I have that has more in-depth thoughts, and I'll have my Vlogmas vlogs linked in the description. So that way, if there's one book that you want to hear me talk more about, you can. I finished 12 books in the month of December, but actually several of them were novellas. One was a short story. So I read a lot of shorter works in December, and I definitely leaned hard into seasonal reading where I read 5 Christmas books in the month of December. So it felt like very, very much a holiday kind of vibe, which was really nice. I read anything from historical fiction to classics, to nonfiction, to sci-fi. It was kind of like all over the place. Some of the books on this list ended up in my favorite books of the year, and some of the books ended up in my least favorite books of the year. So if you've watched those videos already during the 12 Days of Christmas, you will have heard me talk about a couple of these. I'm going to start with my least favorite book and work my way up to my favorite book of the month. So the only book that I actually actively disliked that I read this month and was a 2-star is Mr. Dickens and His Carol. This was actually my very least favorite book of 2024. This book just enraged me in a lot of ways, and I don't think I had any other book that I read this year that actually made me so angry. The reason it made me mad is this is supposed to be a story telling us about how Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, but there's almost nothing about it that is historically accurate whatsoever, except for the fact that Dickens was currently publishing Martin Chuzzlewit and it wasn't doing well, and his publishers wanted him to write a Christmas story. That's the only part of this that is historically accurate. And the author even says in the author's note at the end, she apologizes to anyone who is familiar with the historical time period at all or is a fan of Dickens because she took so many creative liberties. There is a lot of things that happened in this story that, first of all, did not happen at all, and second of all, were wrong, like attitudes or motivations or things that Dickens did in this book that he didn't do at all, just so that way he could have a very contrived Ebenezer Scrooge transformation to inspire him to write A Christmas Carol. It felt extremely forced, and also I really don't like it when people take real historical people and write a fictionalized story about them and then change things about them. And I don't mean changing just like little things. I mean like Dickens looking down on and being unkind to street urchins when that was something that Dickens felt very strongly about in terms of like social injustices of his day. So, I mean, there was just like a lot. This book was just a complete and total mess. I will say it had really beautiful writing though, and that's the reason why I continued with this book, and that's the reason I got 2 stars instead of 1. But maybe it deserves a 1 star. Moving into the 3-star, I actually read a historical romance in December. Can you believe it? This is a book that got recommended to me by my patrons, and so I actually did a whole Patreon vlog for this. That book is A Holiday by Gaslight by Mimi Matthews. This book is so outside my comfort zone, and I didn't even know that when I picked it up. It was recommended by one of my patrons, and I thought it was either historical fiction or historical mystery. And then I start reading it, and I'm like, oh, this is a romance. And I tried to not let that kind of like cloud my judgment of it because I'm just not a romance person. I don't enjoy romantic subplots in books 90% of the time. And that's why I'm not into a lot of like romantasy books that are coming out, because I'm just like really not into like heavily written romances. I will say that I felt like this was fairly decent for a historical romance set in the Victorian time period. I did really like the main characters, and I thought the writing overall was fairly decent. So I thought it was a cute story. It's not one that will be like overly memorable for me, but I'm glad I pushed myself out of my comfort zone and read it. If you're someone who likes historical romances, like the sweet historical romances that are on the clean side, I think You would absolutely love this book. Next, we have Let It Glow. So this is a middle grade Christmas story about two girls who end up meeting each other by chance at this Christmas pageant tryout at a nursing home. And they look at each other and they are identical. They realize both of them have been adopted. They realize that they were separated at birth and adopted to different families. One of them has been raised by a Jewish family, and one has been raised by not a Christian family, but a family that celebrates Christmas. So they decide that they are going to swap families during the holiday season, so that way they can learn about the other one's family traditions during the holidays. It's really cute and really fun. We have chapters written from different characters' perspectives, like one from Holly, who is the girl who celebrates Christmas, and one from Aviva, who's the girl that celebrates Hanukkah. And so we're alternating their perspectives, and they have totally different personalities. And I just thought it was really cute. Overall, I thought it was really sweet and a fun, fluffy Christmas read. Next, we have The Last Murder at the End of the World by Stuart Turton. This is a sci-fi mystery by the same author who wrote The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. This is one that would have been in my last vlog that I never posted, and I definitely had some like in-depth thoughts that I shared there, but oh well, you're just getting a brief overview. This is kind of a little bit middle of the road for me because I thought the premise is super interesting. There are these people who live on this island, and they are trapped on this island because there's been this fog that has like infiltrated the world and killed people, and they are the only survivors. The people who live on this island have 3 scientists who live there who they refer to as the village elders, and those people have figured out how to create a barrier around this island to keep them safe. One of these scientists ends up being killed at the beginning of the book, and when she's killed, the barrier for the fog is brought down. And so then they're trying to figure out what they can do to raise the barrier and who killed this person and what's going on with all this stuff. And there's like some really interesting conversations that I think the author is trying to have about like ethics and morality, but I just felt like there was so much of it that didn't make sense. And I think in a sci-fi, things need to make a little bit more sense than they did, because I had questions at the very beginning of the book about like, well, why is this the way that it is? Or now that things are being resolved in this sort of a direction, well, how is this a resolution to the story? Because don't these people need this thing or this thing that you've said that is now gone, or, you know, whatever. I'm being specifically as vague as I can be. Those questions were never answered at all. So I feel like Stuart Turton can kind of be hit or miss for me, and that he has like super interesting plot ideas, but I don't always love the way that they're executed. I also kind of struggled with the writing of this book. I think maybe it was a me problem, because I had the same issue with 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle in the beginning, that it took me a while to get into it, and I actually almost DNF'd that one in the beginning. I still enjoyed that one a lot better than I enjoyed this one, because I felt like this one made even less sense, although 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, it's very valid when people criticize the ending of that book, but for some reason that didn't keep me from enjoying that one, but it did keep me from enjoying this one a little bit more. Next, we have Cranford, which I read with my Patreon. It was technically our group read for November. We discussed it in December, and I didn't finish it until December. I liked it. I thought it was really cozy, really fun, but nothing like super memorable. It's about this town called Cranford, and pretty much everyone who lives there is a woman, with the exception of just a couple of people. And so there's some really interesting dynamics, and there's some really interesting stories, and I liked it. I think it's more on the 3.5 side than the 3 side. So I did really enjoy it. I just didn't find it to be like overly memorable or impactful, but it was a really nice book to read in November and December because it had a really cozy feel. Moving into 4 stars at the bottom of the pile, we have Too Busy Not to Pray by Bill Hybels. This is a Christian nonfiction all about prayer, and this is it's a good book, but I don't felt like it was one that was like overall deeply impactful to me. I think it kind of is a little bit more on the basic side. I actually wish I had read this book when I was younger. My husband has owned this book almost for the entirety of our marriage, and I think that this book would have been life-changing for me if I had read it sometime in my 20s, or if this had been the first book that I read about prayer, because it talks about the importance of prayer, and it gives some really practical applications, some of which are things I hadn't thought about before and I will be implementing in my prayer life. But there were things about it that I'm like, oh, I've read books that went more in depth on this or were more practical or, whatever. So that's why it gets a 4-star rating for me instead of a 5-star. But I'm still really glad that I read it. And I think it's a wonderful book. If you're someone who wants to pray more or have more of a discipline of a prayer life, then I think that this book is such a good practical book. My next 4-star book is an Anthony Trollope. Can you believe it? After how much I've talked about how I have such a mixed relationship with Anthony Trollope, I read Christmas at Thompson Hall, which is a Christmas short story or novella, somewhere in that range. And this is just like such a funny short story. Like, I enjoyed it so much. It's my favorite Trollope I've read so far, and the only Trollope that I've given like a firm 4 stars to. Like, I just had so much fun with this book. There's like definitely like a lot of hijinks that happen. It's about this woman and her husband, and they typically spend Christmases in a warmer area, and she convinces her husband that they need to go back to England for Christmas because her sister's engaged and someone in her family has received some sort of award or accolade, something like that. And so she really wants to go back to England for Christmas. And so there's kind of some mishaps that happen along the way, as well as once they actually arrive. And my word, it was so much fun through and through. The last 4-star book I have on here is Attack on Titan, Volume 14. This is a really interesting volume because it's one that we don't see any Titans at all. And you would think that that would make this one that I don't really like very much, but it was really interesting because we're kind of delving into a lot of the politics of the world in this volume. And if you know me, you know I love fake politics. Don't want real politics. Keep that away from me. But books that are like this, which is kind of like a sci-fi horror dystopian, when they explore politics within their world, it opens like broader conversations that are really, really interesting. And so that's how I felt about this one. There were moments that were really brutal in this one that were very difficult to read, and I found myself like wanting to close my eyes, and I'm like, I can't. This is a manga. I can't close my eyes. I have to like read it. So definitely, I guess all of the volumes have moments of brutality, but this was the most difficult one for me so far in respect to that, or maybe I would have even rated it 5 stars. Okay, we're moving on to the 5 stars. I have 2 rereads in here and 1 book that I've been reading over a very long period of time. 2 of these books made it into my favorites of the year. So that's amazing. At the bottom of the 5 stars is A Christmas Carol, which I reread for my British literature class that I'm teaching at my homeschool group, and it's just as lovely as ever. It's actually not one of my favorite Dickens, but I still feel like it deserves 5 stars, not only because it's a beautiful story, but because it has had such a lasting impact on Christmas culture and all that kind of stuff in our celebration and movies, Christmas movies that have been made. Like, there's so much about this that just has had such staying power and is so well done. And it was really fun to read this and then like a week later watch A Muppet Christmas Carol and kind of compare the two because I grew up watching A Muppet Christmas Carol. So it was just delightful. I also read it at the same time that I read Mr. Dickens and His Carol, which I think made me see the shortcomings of Mr. Dickens and His Carol that much more. Next, we have Small Things Like These. This is a teeny tiny novella. I did talk about this in a vlog because it was the first brand new 5-star book that I had read in months. The last time I had had a 5-star, I think, was in August or maybe June or July. I don't know, sometime in the summer. So I had gone months without a brand new 5-star. I'd had lots of 4 stars. I'd had some 5 stars that were rereads, but not any brand new 5 stars. So this is a historical fiction that is a very tiny book, around 100 pages, and very slow, quiet book about a man who was born as an illegitimate child in a time where that was very much not approved of. And his childhood and his overall life could have ended up so much differently, but for the kindness of people around him who helped raise him and helped support his mother. So now he is an adult and has a wife and children of his own, and he's living in a town where there are some things happening that are kind of like being swept under the rug, and he kind of has to decide what role he's going to play in all of this. And it's a deeply reflective book. It's not a book that is very plot heavy. It's not a book that really fully examines much of the historical context of the time. The point is not that. The point is the self-reflection of the main character, and then that spurring on self-reflection in yourself. And it did that for me, which is why I loved it so much. In December, I reread David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. And man, I had not read this since I was either a teenager or a young adult. I can't remember which. I've only read it once before. And I see why this is people's favorite Dickens. I feel like it's still not quite for me, but it's like, it's probably number 2. I don't know. Maybe it's not, because I find that a lot of times when I talk about like, what's my favorite Dickens book? Like oftentimes it's the last one that I read because I just thoroughly enjoy Dickens' works. I think Our Mutual Friend is still my favorite, but currently this is sitting at number 2, but that might get dethroned when I read my next Dickens or reread my next Dickens, because so many of his works are so deeply impactful. David Copperfield is one of his most autobiographical works in that it reflects some of his own upbringing. There's a character that is modeled after his father, and so there's a journey there that does parallel some of Dickens' own life, but it's so beautiful. And I don't want to be spoilery, but I do want to tell you what was the most emotional part of the book for me. So that way, those of you who have read it will know what I'm talking about. And those of you who have not read it, it won't be spoilery. But anyways, my favorite character in this book ended up being Mr. Peggotty, because his relationship and his attitude towards his niece, Emily, brought me to tears multiple times. Just such a beautiful reflection of Christ's love. And oh, such a great book. The last book, the favorite book of the month, is Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset. If you see my top books of the year, you're not surprised. This made it into the top 3, so it's no surprise that it was my favorite of December. This is such a melancholy book because it deals very heavily with sin and the consequences of sin, the guilt and the remorse that follows, whether or not you can allow yourself to be forgiven, and how your reaction to whether or not you feel like you can be forgiven impacts your relationships, impacts your marriage, the way that you parent, the way the rest of your life plays out. Because we follow Kristin from a very young girl. I think at the beginning of the book, she's like 6 or 7, all the way up through her life. And so we see how she was raised, and then how she goes and does what she wants to do. And just there's a whole battle throughout the entirety of the book of Kristin's will versus God's will. And there are people who come into her life and speak truth over her in such beautiful moments. And how does Kristin react to that or not react to that? And there's just, there's so much about this book that I loved. And it's one that I can't stop thinking about since I finished it. And granted, at the time of filming this, it hasn't been that long since I finished it, but I think it's one that is going to have like a long lasting impact on me, and one that I think about often, and one that I will certainly reread. Well, that's my wrap up of books that I read in December, of how I closed out the year. Honestly, December was a great reading month, even though it had my least favorite book of the year. It also had several of my favorite books of the year, so I had some amazing 5 stars and then some less than amazing books. So I felt like I ran the whole gamut in the month of December. I would love to hear from you in the comments down below. Of course, I would love to hear what you thought about any of the books that I have read or mentioned in this video, but I'd also love to hear what was your favorite book that you read in the month of December. Was December a good reading month for you? Did you end out the year strong, or was it just kind of meh? Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.